Japan was not the only high-performance economy in Asia that in the 1990s found itself in the deepest recession since the Great Depression. In 1997, the currencies of the Southeast Asian tiger economies could not maintain a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar. They collapsed by between 60 and 80% within a year. The causes for this crash went as far back as 1993. In that year, the Asian tiger economies, South Korea, Thailand and Indonesia, implemented a policy of aggressive deregulation of the capital account and the establishment of international banking facilities, which enabled the corporate and banking sectors to borrow liberally from abroad. The first time in the post-war era that borrowers could do so. In reality, there was no need for the Asian tiger economies to borrow money from abroad. All the money necessary for domestic investment could be created at home. Indeed, the pressure to liberalize capital flows came from outside. Since the early 1990s, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and the US Treasury had been lobbying these countries to allow domestic firms to borrow from abroad. They argued that neoclassical economics had proven that free markets and free capital movement increased economic growth. Once the capital accounts had been deregulated, the central banks set about creating irresistible incentives for domestic firms to borrow from abroad by making it more expensive to borrow in their own domestic currencies than it was to borrow in US dollars.
Domestic local interest rates were higher than the US dollar interest rate, okay? And the exchange rate was virtually fixed.
It was the government and the central bank that said, we will maintain the exchange rate.
That's right. That's right. Central banks of Thailand and other East Asian countries resisted exchange rate adjustment, and they tried to send a signal that they would protect the exchange rate.
The central banks emphasized in their public statements that they would maintain fixed exchange rates with the US dollar, so that borrowers did not have to worry about paying back more in their domestic currencies than they had originally borrowed.
When I went to Thailand, I was actually on an ADB mission as an outside consultant. I went straight to the Bank of Thailand and asked them, were there any informal credit guidance schemes? And they were surprised that I asked this question, because of my study of Japan, I thought perhaps there's something similar. And they told me it was a young staff who perhaps wasn't aware of the politics involved. He said, yeah, we have this credit planning scheme.
Banks were ordered to increase lending, but they were faced with less loan demand from the productive sectors of the economy, because these firms had been given incentives to borrow from abroad instead. They therefore had to resort to increasing their lending to higher risk borrowers. Imports began to shrink because the central banks had agreed to peg their currencies to the US dollar. The economies became less competitive, but their current account balance was maintained due to the foreign issued loans, which count as exports in the balance of payment statistics. When speculators began to sell the Thai baht, the Korean won, and the Indonesian rupee, the respective central banks responded with futile attempts to maintain the peg until they had squandered virtually all of their foreign exchange reserves. This gave foreign lenders ample opportunity to withdraw their money at the overvalued exchange rates. The central banks knew that if the countries ran out of foreign exchange reserves, they would have to call in the IMF to avoid default. And once the IMF came in, the central banks knew what this Washington-based institution would demand. For its demands in such cases had been the same for the previous 3 decades. The central banks would be made independent. On the 16th of July, the Thai finance minister took a plane to Tokyo to ask Japan for a bailout. At the time, Japan had $213 billion in foreign exchange reserves, more than the total resources of the IMF. They were willing to help, but Washington stopped Japan's initiative. Any solution to the emerging Asian crisis had to come from Washington via the IMF.
After 2 months of speculative attacks, the Thai government floated the baht.
Well, the International Monetary Fund to date has promised almost $120 billion to the embattled economies of Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea.
Immediately after arrival in the crisis-stricken countries, the IMF teams set up offices inside the central banks, from where they dictated what amounted to terms of surrender. The IMF demanded a string of policies, including curbs on central bank and bank credit creation, major legal changes, and sharp rises in interest rates. As interest rates rose, high-risk borrowers began to default on their loans. Burdened with large amounts of bad debts, the banking systems of Thailand, Korea, and Indonesia were virtually bankrupt. Even otherwise healthy firms started to suffer from the widening credit crunch. Corporate bankruptcies soared. Unemployment rose to the highest level since the 1930s.
The role of the fund in coming to the rescue of ailing nations has been fiercely debated. Some have even accused the IMF of actually making Asia's economic crisis worse.
Even if they have to subvert our economy, they will do so just to prove that they are right. The IMF has not been very helpful.
The IMF knew well what the consequences of its policies would be. In the Korean case, they even had detailed but undisclosed studies prepared that had calculated just how many Korean companies would go bankrupt if interest rates were to rise by 5 percentage points. The IMF's first agreement with Korea demanded a rise of exactly 5 percentage points in interest rates.
The IMF policies are clearly not aimed at creating economic recoveries in the Asian countries. They pursue quite a different agenda, and that is to change the economic, social, and political systems in those countries. In fact, the IMF deals prevent the countries concerned, like Korea, Thailand, to reflate.
Interesting. You're saying it's making the crisis worse, and you're suggesting that the IMF has a hidden agenda.
Well, I mean, it's not very hidden, this agenda, because the IMF quite clearly demands that the Asian countries concerned have to change the laws so that foreign interests can buy anything from banks to land. And in fact, the banking systems can only be recapitalized, according to the IMF deals, by using foreign money, which is not necessary at all, because as long as these countries have central banks, they could just print money and recapitalize the banking systems. You don't need foreign money for that. So the agenda is clearly to crack open Asia for foreign interests.
The IMF demanded that troubled banks would not be bailed out, but instead closed down and sold off cheaply as distressed assets, often to large US investment banks.
One positive coming out of Thailand is that they'll be auctioning off some major assets from 56 finance companies. In your view, should some of the owners from the 56 finance companies be allowed to buy back their assets?
In most cases, the IMF dictated letters of intent explicitly stated that the banks had to be sold to foreign investors.
And let me emphasize in that respect that these reform programs are the key, the absolute key, to restoring financial stability.
For the first time ever, South Korea closed 5 banks in a major step toward meeting its IMF mandate.
The number of commercial banks has declined, has been reduced as a result of closure, mergers, and acquisitions, and the foreign strategic investors are now in, which is a remarkable change.
In Asia, government-organized bailouts to keep ailing financial institutions alive were not allowed. But when a similar crisis struck back home in America a year later, the very same institutions reacted differently. The Connecticut-based hedge fund, Long-Term Capital Management, which accepted as clients only high-net-worth individual investors and institutions, had leveraged its $5 billion in client capital by more than 25 times, borrowing more than $100 billion from the world's banks. When its losses threatened to undermine the banks that had lent to it, with the possibility of a systemic banking crisis that would endanger the US financial system and economy, the Federal Reserve organized a cartel-like bailout by leaning on Wall Street and international banks to contribute funds so that it could avoid default.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The views from Washington and New York seemed certainly quite flexible, because soon after they told all the Asian countries no bailouts for financial institutions, when then Long-Term Capital Management, a hedge fund in New York, almost went bust, suddenly a bailout was organized, just contradicting what they'd said to the Asian countries.
But they say that there are no public money used for LTCM.
But the meeting was held famously inside the Federal Reserve, right?
Why would the United States make demands on foreign nations in the name of the free market when it has no intention of enforcing the same rules within its own borders?